Welcome to the Starfish in the Church podcast. Starfish leaders are committed to unlocking the collective strength, intelligence, and impact of every leader and every team in their influence. Starfish leaders see family trees, not org charts. And let's admit it, the weight of top-down, disempowering, highly centralized leadership is crushing the church, burning out leaders, and increasing the cynicism of those outside the faith. We hope our book, The Starfish and the Spirit, and this podcast will help inspire and equip you and others to rediscover a form of leadership that unleashes joy and flourishing, builds community, lightens the load, equips everyone, and unlocks the multiplication of disciples, leaders, and fresh forms of church.
Well, hi there, friends. We are excited today with this newest episode of the Starfish in the Church podcast. We're delighted that you've decided to join us. And this is a conversation that Rob and I have really been looking forward to ever since we read the book and said, man, we want to get Chuck DeGroat on this podcast. And we hope it won't be the last time either. So Chuck has written several books. His latest book, When Narcissism Comes to the Church, has really spoken volumes in this day and age of the church leadership industrial complex that we're in. And but Chuck is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary, where Rob's wife, actually, Michelle, is a student at Western. He's a senior fellow at Newbigin House of Studies.
Absolutely loves it.
Yeah. And obviously, he's an author, speaker, consultant, and Chuck is married to Sarah and has 2 teenage daughters. And so, Chuck, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for this work, this podcast. You've had so many really good guests on in your book. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Well, we have, as soon as we saw your book, and you know this, it's such a timely voice into a situation that is really, I don't think it's overstating the matter to say that narcissism or narcissistic tendencies from one degree or another on the spectrum portion in church leadership circles. And so we could not have a more important conversation, I don't believe.
Well, Chuck, I have to be honest. Your work has caused me to have to look pretty deeply in the mirror at my own soul. And my journey, having led large churches, one of those churches was, the kind of church that was on all the outreach beauty pageant lists of fastest growing, most influential, most innovative. And I got to a place in my journey where, I began to see how much of my identity I had wrapped up into that role. And then as the Lord, like the multi-stage healing, of the blind man, like, all right, I can see a little clearer. I began to see how much that was woven into some real deep woundedness in my family and dysfunction. And the Lord just sort of graciously, patiently began to help me see a better way. And it was weird. It was like being in my 30s and realizing, wow, some ways I'm like a 7-year-old scared little boy emotionally. And man, have I been trying hard not to be that kid. So I'm very grateful for your work. And I do want to just normalize this. I want to try to take the stigma out of it for everybody that's listening right now. We hope that you'll see this as an invitation to freedom, not a voice of condemnation. Yes. So I'm curious, I'm just going to go ahead and go there. Like, what about your own journey with narcissism? Hey, what's been your journey to be pulled into this particular dimension of your life's work? I'm curious.
Yeah. So, I think you guys might agree with this, maybe not, but I think everything we write is somewhat autobiographical. And I remember back in 1997, I was pretty arrogant seminary student who had just gone off to England to study, came back wearing hats, sweatshirts, Oxford University. I was going to go to school overseas.
Have you seen my sweatshirt?
Yeah, that was exactly it. And I'm incredibly grateful that a counseling professor in seminary pulled me aside and said, Chuck, if you do not do your work, you will be dangerous to the church, and you're probably already dangerous to your wife. And I was 27 years old at that time. And I was resistant at first to what he had to say, obviously. And then I leaned in and started to do some of my own work. I did a mental health counseling program at the school that I went to, the seminary I went to, decided against the PhD work. And but then in ministry, very early on in the late 90s, I was in a church plant, fast-growing church plant in the suburbs, where I was seeing a number of folks within the congregation as a pastoral counselor, where I was seeing dynamics of narcissism and abuse, but I wasn't really allowed to say it out loud. I wasn't really, because these are folks who are tithing to the church, and I was quickly recognizing that there are some things you talk about and some things you don't talk about. I had the same experience when I started doing assessments in the denomination that I was in at the time, church planning assessments. I'd be that, maybe you guys have been on teams like this, where I was the psychologist on the team who everyone else is like, this guy's great. And I'm the one who's like, oh, but I have a little bit of a yellow flag here. And so that work was in the early 2000s. I started doing assessments. I've been doing assessments now for the last 15 years or so. And I have seen steadily over the years that the large percentage of pastors are on what we call the cluster B personality disorders, which includes the narcissistic spectrum. That doesn't mean that they're narcissistic personality disorder. It does mean that ministry attracts people who like to be on stage, like to have some influence, like to speak the words of God with the authority of God, some things like that might be important for us to recognize and wrestle with.
And I would guess, Chuck, just to interrupt just for a second, that's true of many different careers. It's true of probably work in politics. It's true of probably entertainers. Am I right?
That's exactly right. Lawyers, politics, entertainers. I think that there are, listen, I don't see people with avoidant personality, dependent personality spectrum in ministry, or test in that on that spectrum. But these are generally folks who are drawn to the drama, drawn to the stage, drawn to help, and so that's okay. I mean, I think part of this is acknowledging that there are particular personality proclivities, right, for ministry that probably each and every one of us likes to step into the spotlight every now and then, on behalf of God, to speak the word of God. And yet, there are some among us who are who've not done their work. Like Rob, you just said a moment ago, you talked about that 7-year-old, right? Who are not aware of the vulnerabilities, who are not aware that, that on the flip side are parts of us that carry profound shame, longing, who want to be seen, who want to be noticed. And I think the healthiest among us are able to say, I think that the me that got on stage today was really hungry for attention, really hungry for affection, and is now beating himself up for not stringing all the words together correctly, as I probably will after this podcast.
That's so good. So we were talking just for a few minutes before we went on air, Chuck. It's always fun to, even as fellow authors here, it's fun to hear the journey of a book and how did a book come together, and what was the burden for the book. And it was interesting that actually the publisher, so IVP, came to you and had to push you in a corner, like, come on, you need to write this book. So why were you reticent to write the book?
So it started even before that. I was doing some consulting for a large church, what we'd call a mega church. And this resulted in some pain within the church, some really hard decisions to remove the pastor from leadership, just a lot a lot of deep work with the staff, right? And in the midst of that, a number of the senior staff members came to me and said, is there something that I can read that would kind of put all this together? Some of the dynamics that we're seeing, but not be one of those books that says, crucify him, something that engaged the conversation with some generosity and yet spoke some truth. And I said, I don't know of something like that. And they said, well, you ought to write it. And I said, no way. There's just no way. I'm not interested in that. I had written this book called Wholeheartedness that was very much kind of a book that emerged from my heart with neuroscience and psychology and theology and poetry. This felt like a duty and not a delight. But Jeff Crosby, the publisher at IVP, he and I met at one point. I shared with him some ideas, and he said, that does sound like a really important book. And I think it's a book that would gain some attention just because of what we're seeing in the church, Me Too, Church Too. And so I entered into it really reluctantly. And to be honest with you guys, I've engaged it really reluctantly as well. I mean, I think some people, you have to do the obligatory social media stuff when your book comes.
You have to do the podcast and things like that.
Yeah, you have to be like, oh God, Rob and Lance called, so we got to go on the podcast. But there is a part of me that's like, wow, this is painful to talk about at some level, right? Not least because I've got to wrestle with my own stuff at the same time,
Yeah, that's part. We tried to write our book from that posture too, where we're critiquing a certain form of leadership culture and systems that actually enhance or accelerate that kind of narcissism.
Yes.
Versus a more kind of generous, servant-oriented, decentralized equipping culture that's about everybody actually reaching their maximum influence and not a few. And when we started the center section of the book, where we're talking about a culture of multiplying leaders, we started by trying to share our stories, both ways that we had what we affectionately call spider bit other people, how had we been complicit, but then also the ways that we've been wounded. And one of the things I appreciate about your book at the end is you approach it from both dimensions too. Helping those that have been abused, kind of what are the steps towards wholeness and healing, and those that have been spider biting people, how do I walk towards healing and freedom? So I was wondering, for the listener maybe hasn't read your book yet, could you sort of give a general sort of overview of those journeys? Because I think that's ultimately what this is about. Let's address the problem so we can actually move forward.
Yeah. Well, so by way of overview, I think I wanted to start by just describing the phenomenon. We talk a lot about narcissism, and people use it as a word to label politicians and pastors. I really wanted to treat it more responsibly than that, and I also wanted to say sometimes I'm not entirely comfortable with even the language of personality disorders, because it seems like what we're saying is this describes all of who a person is. And so I begin by talking about how narcissism is a way of naming a pattern that we see in a person. And I go on to describe what that pattern looks like through the lens of psychology, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Personality Disorder or Mental Health Disorders. I nuance it a little bit because I think it's important to see shades of narcissism in different ways, not just the standard grandiosity, entitlement, attention seeking, lack of empathy, which we typically talk about. So I talk a little bit about grandiose, but I also talk about a more covert or vulnerable kind of narcissism. And then for fans of the Enneagram, years ago, I got introduced to the Enneagram in the late 90s and immediately saw the compatibility with some psychological categories. And you could see with different Enneagram types, the propensity to a particular kind of way of showing up narcissistically. And so I've been playing with that. And that was a more suggestive chapter to say, I do think that each and every one of these ways of showing up in the world can show up narcissistically. And so that's been a fun chapter to tease out. I've done whole episodes on the Enneagram and narcissism. on podcasts, but talk about the characteristics of a narcissistic leader. We talk about systems and narcissism, but also talk about healing. What's really interesting to me is probably some of the most controversial stuff has been, everyone kind of thought going into this is, well, you're just going to beat up pastors. And I'm like, listen, I was a pastor for a long time. I train pastors now. My intention is not to beat up pastors. What I get on the other side of things sometimes is you actually think that there's some healing that's possible, because I think people who've been hurt so deeply by narcissistic abuse, they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear, hey, there's more to the story. They just want to hear what's accountability, what's justice in this situation. So I try to pave a way to healing that honors both the person who's been abused, the survivor, the victim, and the person who is on the narcissistic spectrum.
Chuck, when you're in your experience, typically, what does it look like when someone begins to wake up to the narcissistic tendencies? Like, what are the warning lights on the dash? And I just want to invite all of us to just open ourselves up as we listen to this. What does that typically look like?
Well, I think when people begin to wake up to their narcissistic tendencies, in the best sense of that, there's a humility and a curiosity that emerges. In the worst sense of it, there's a resistance. There's I am going to shut down this conversation, and the defensive walls go up, because you got to realize that within the defensive walls of the castle is a really vulnerable little girl, little boy. You're not going to touch him. He carries around all the pain, all the hurt. But I think, on the sort of challenging side of things, there's resistance. On the positive side of things, there's curiosity, there's humility, there's the beginning of, so I wonder how this impacts people. I wonder why I've shown up for all these years, and it generally goes way, way back, because we're talking about some core wounds.
Yes.
But I wonder why I show up in a way that is so bullying, so arrogant, that lacks curiosity, that tends to micromanage. And so that's when I know, like when I put my therapist hat on, that's when I know that I'm working with someone who is willing to do the work, when they relax that kind of more grandiose, egocentric part of themselves to be curious about, so what else is going on inside of me? What pain do I carry in me? What shame, what wounds? That makes, at least for me, I'm a therapist. Some people are listening to this like, God, I wouldn't want to go there with Chuck. But at least for me, those kinds of conversations are really animating.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Lance.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask. So, I mean, I guess I would just have to ask this question: is this myth or truth? So this question, because most of us have always heard that of all the disorders, narcissism, you can't really get healed from it.
Yes.
You can never get over it. Truth or fiction?
Good question. I think this is where I nuance the narcissism conversation by talking about it in terms of a spectrum, where we talk about narcissistic style. There's a test that I use, in fact, that goes way back to the research of Theodore Milan, where he puts people on a continuum: narcissistic style, type, and disorder. Narcissistic style, you can that might look like a really confident pastor. Narcissistic type might look like someone who bullies or is egocentric at times, but might be willing to look at that. There might be an openness to repentance, to humility. Narcissistic personality disorders, where we see that narcissistic self, false self, so hardened that there really isn't much curiosity or humility at that point. And that's why I think some people, Lance, would say that this is the personality disorder that can't be healed. I would say that, and I'll give you, without fuzzing up the details just a little bit, there's a guy who I started engaging back in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, let's say, church planner, who began engaging the work, was diagnosably narcissistic personality disorder, lots of accountability around him, had to step away from ministry altogether, got into a completely different occupation, has been working on himself for many, many years. About 3 years ago, saw him, he said, I'm thinking about stepping back in. I felt even a little bit cautious after 7 or 8 years. He said, oh, no. As a volunteer, I'm just going to volunteer to clean the bathrooms. That's all I'm going to do. 2 years later, he said, I've been cleaning the bathrooms. I think, they want to pay me $10 an hour to do it. That's great. I do it 10 hours a week. That's all. So this very slow process to recovery, where he's done deep work in his marriage and his relationships. What you and I see all the time are these guys who jump right back in. There's some accountability. They get caught, something happens, and then they're back in ministry in a different location, different city. 2 years later, that's a problem. Yeah.
Culturally, if you were coaching a church team on how to create a culture that would be averse to narcissism, that would facilitate a sense of true mutual submission, celebration of kind of diversity of gifts and voices. Like when you're consulting with churches, what are the kind of practices and values that you're coaching them in to help basically create a church culture, a leadership culture that would really make it difficult for a narcissist to thrive?
Well, so now I would give them your book, The Starfish and Spirit.
Wow, did that work out good?
Well, this is just, boy, guys, you just set this up. I don't know what to think here. Here's the thing. Here's an honest answer to your question. I've done a little bit of that work, but I generally say no, because I think that there are, to be honest, guys like you who have the experience and training and and understanding of systems to do that work. I think I'm really good at doing the individual work with people. Beautiful. And contribute on that level. I think at 50 years old, I've had to say, I can go in and I can do consultations where we can deconstruct the system. But in terms of putting into place practices for health, hey, Rob and Lance have written a book. Go ahead and read that. Check out Todd Bolsinger's work. There are folks like you guys who are contributing so beautifully to this conversation. This is where we were talking before we jumped on that, there are a number of books, including yours, Diane Langberg, Scott McKnight, and Laura Behringer's, Wade Mullins. These are coming out around the same time, and that's not a coincidence, I don't think. So I don't hesitate to say, read your book, read Robin Lance's book,
Appreciate that. I'm curious, the reaction to your book, the reception, which to me seems very positive. Of course, it would be very hard for a clinical narcissist to write you and go, hey man, back off. How can they really even flame you in a review or whatever? But have you been surprised, or what did you expect as far as the reception of the book? What's that been like for you?
I was anxious. I was really anxious going into it. I mean, some of that is just, there's some anxiety and some shame in my story, and a part of me that said they are going to crucify you. They're going to come after you. And so there was some of that. I think that I've been pleasantly surprised by the reception. I mean, there have been a couple of folks on kind of the outlier sides of this. Early on, I had someone say, you do not take abuse seriously enough. A narcissist is wicked. You didn't say that. It's black and white, and you were too gray. And I can't recommend anything you do. And then, there have been a few pastors who've said, why would you do this to us? Why would you shine a spotlight on this issue? We're just it's so hard. We're just trying to keep our heads above water, which I completely get. Right now, I mean, of course, this comes out right in the midst of COVID-19, and we're all that much more exhausted, right? I really understand that. That's not at all what I wanted to do. But by and large, I think the reception has been really strong with a lot of curiosity, and I think people using this to put words to what they're seeing in systems, what they're experiencing as staff members of churches. You know, my own experience is a story of being on staff at a church where there were dynamics that were really troublesome, and I just didn't have words to put to it back in the day.
Yeah.
I've had people come to me and say, "Hey, I feel less crazy now. I think you just put words to," and yet you did not jump to, well, in the midst of this, let's just crucify the pastor. But you paint a picture of a process and of hope, and that's what, you know, frankly, for me, it gives me the most hope, is that I think it's created a conversation that by and large is pretty balanced. And I think that in the end, that's what all of us want, right? We want people to engage our books in a conversational kind of way, and with curiosity and with humility for the sake of the health of the church.
Well, I mean, the book to me is written in that spirit, Chuck. I just think you did a beautiful job of it. And man, I think of, you know, when we think about John 1:14 and 15, Jesus was the Word made flesh, and we beheld the glory of God full of grace and truth. I really felt like you had a balance of grace and truth. So anybody that's looking forward to reading this book because they're looking for a tell-all, type of a current affair book, they're going to be really disappointed because you did not go in there with guns blazing, crucifying people. You went in there fully with the intent of bringing healing and hope to the church, pastors. I think you did a great balance.
It's one of the things that we debated going in, because there was this sense of, I think if you name names, I think if you told some stories, and there are some stories that we all know about, people would jump all over. I mean, there was this moment in conversation with someone who said your sales would go through the roof, and I said I am not really interested in that. And I think what I think we all managed to accomplish, because this takes a really good editor and other folks at a publishing company. I think what we accomplished was. Is that a loud noise in the background suddenly?
Right.
We're good.
Just a little organics in the background. We're all right.
Yeah. I think what ended up happening is I told stories in a way that they were amalgamations of several stories, right? Sure. But everyone who reads the book says, I think you told the story of my pastor. That's my church, or that's exactly what I went through. And because these stories are archetypal in a way, almost, I mean, the people look at them, hear them, read them, and they say, well, that sounds a whole lot like what I went through at my church. Were you telling the story of such and such Baptist, Presbyterian, non-denominational church, right? So,
Which just shows how prevalent it is. The issue is.
Chuck, I was going to ask, sometimes when people think of narcissism, they're thinking of like that, coercive bullying, which can be absolutely a dimension of it. But another one is like that, the grooming, and then of course sort of the sinister gaslighting techniques. And you were actually addressing this, where people started to think like, am I crazy? So let's say someone's listening right now. Like give them some handholds to sort of go, okay, how do I know if I'm actually maybe working with or working for someone that's maybe moving beyond narcissistic style to type, or maybe even further down the continuum, and you're not just crazy?
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting about this is people discover, I think this is a story. I mean, you had Scott on, you've talked a little bit about the Willow Creek situation, that has gotten some publicity. I mean, it takes some people trusting their gut, saying there's something off here, and I think that's the beginning of it. I can describe the characteristics, but until you say, well, I think I've been in a situation like that where I've got this pastor and he's really charismatic. He's an incredible preacher. Everyone loves him. The fruit is exceptional. And yet, he'll come into my office and he will just undress me, with words in a bullying kind of way. And he'll walk away and I will feel so ashamed. And his words will be so condescending and hurtful. What's up with that? That's where it begins, is that with that kind of curiosity, what's up with that? How come this person I admire so much is at one and the same time someone who can be so shaming and so condescending. And I often tell folks that that's a good place to begin, maybe not with all the categories, all the definitions, but with a real gut experience of, so what's going on here? What am I experiencing? Does that make sense?
It does. And then should they, like, as a next step, it's like, who do you process this with without feeling like, oh, I'm gossiping, I'm undercutting leadership, I'm not honoring my leaders. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And so often the advice, the counsel is, well, you need to go and confront that pastor. You need to go and expose him to the elder board. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second, put on the brakes, because you're just coming to an understanding of how you're impacted by this. And there's likely some trauma there. And now I put my therapist hat on, right? And I'm thinking it's really important for you to spend some time sitting with someone who understands trauma, can tease out the dynamics in your story, and can help you put words to this, put voice to this, and engage it, and maybe even in a larger way in time, but not right away, and certainly not reactively, And so there are moments sometimes where I'll get a call from someone, and they'll say, I've just discovered that my pastor's a narcissist, and I just wrote this letter and we're going to expose him. And I'm like, have you asked the question, how's this impacted me? How am I hurting? What do I need? How does God want to begin the work of healing my wounds? No, I haven't done that. We just need to take him down. He's a narcissist. Okay, so let's just slow down. Why don't you do some work? Now, I think that it's important for there to be accountability. And I know you wrote a book that gets at how systems can be so profoundly damaging, right? I do want to think about carefully with people who understand systems like you guys about how we do the work of exposing within a system. And I've been involved consulting in situations like that. It's exhausting work, so exhausting. To send one person who's been hurt into sort of the belly of the beast on their own, I think is really unwise. And so there's a lot to be done before that.
Those are wise words. I have thought I've told Rob this, I have thought from time to time about starting an anonymous book of the month club that people could actually subscribe to, and then we send books like yours to these pastors anonymously.
Yeah.
I think it would probably really do well.
Yeah. And it has been the case. And again, I won't name names or give details, but it has been the case where I've had some senior pastors, lead pastors of large churches express some curiosity about this, and then in the same week get an email from someone in that church to say, this person is a narcissistic leader. What do I do about it? And I'm sure you guys, we receive those kinds of emails all the time from people just wanting help, right? But what I guess to come around on that, I mean, what has pleasantly surprised me is there have been a number of pastors who said, so how do I begin the journey of discovering, am I a narcissist? Because, I don't want to think that I am, but I think it's possible. And I always say, if you're beginning with curiosity, chances are you're probably not narcissistic personality disorder. Those are the guys who are saying, don't read Chuck DeGroat's book. It's toxic. It's damaging, But I'm thankful for some of the folks who've reached out with some curiosity.
Chuck, we one of the things we talk about in our book is the current leadership system, which is often built like a pyramid with one or a few people kind of holding the power, like it's a currency to be protected, and the platform where the kind of the celebrity culture of America is infected the way that we perceive the platform, where it's almost like a hidden hierarchy or caste system, and that those aren't neutral spaces. Like a human soul can't actually bear the weight of that kind of hierarchy, and it wasn't the way Jesus designed the church. And when the platform becomes that kind of place, there's a gravitational pull. And so, when I'm talking with other men and women who are in those spaces, because you can't always like flip the switch on those things overnight, you know. I encourage a certain set of like practices, for example, like what Willard calls the disciplines of abstinence, you know, like silence and secrecy, solitude, confession of sin. Like, I'm curious from your perspective, you know, what are the practices for the individual that you encourage, either relationally or spiritually or emotionally, that will help you really build up your immune system, you know, so that you can, while you're trying to make the change in a church culture, for example, like you can actually use the platform to deconstruct the platform, right? So like when you're in the middle of that tension, how do you withstand it? You know, what are the things that you encourage?
You know, one of the practices that I encourage pastors who I train here now, and pastors who've been doing it for years, and more often than not, they tell me they've never heard this before, is the practice of asking the question, how do you experience me? That turns out for many pastors, is a very difficult question. You know, imagine sitting down with someone who serves under you and asking the question, how do you experience me? Well, you know, there are times when you can be really encouraging, and then there are the other times when you are a bully, and it's really hard for me. That question has been an active part of my own pastoring and leadership for the last 15 years or so. And it's interesting now, I'm a seminary prof, right? And a student took me up on it not long ago. It's probably 3 years ago or so. Comes up to my office and says, hey, you know that question you asked? And I'm like, oh boy, here we go. He said, you know, you talk a lot about presence, but you walk 100 miles an hour through the atrium of the seminary. You're always in a rush to go somewhere. And I never feel like I can get your attention. Why is there such a contradiction between what you say and how you show up? And I was like, oh, wow. Whoa. So I said, tell me more about that. Tell me more about how you know, and so those are the really challenging questions that we've got to lean into, I think, as leaders. I do have, and the next book that I'm working on really gets at my model of doing the deep work with pastors and leaders, but are the three questions of Genesis chapter 3, which I translate as, well, of course, where are you? And then which gets at, how are you showing up in the world? Who told you? Which I think gets at, what are the voices that you're listening to? A lot of us as pastors are when we get down to what's going on inside, we are formed by narratives that say, you're not doing enough. You got, you know, and so who told you? And then God asks, have you eaten from the tree? And I translate that, where have you taken your hunger? Where am I going as a leader with my hunger? You know, am I going to the stage? Am I going to the applause? Like, where do I take my hunger? And what are the good and substantial places to take my hunger and thirst? And so that'll be the kind of the next piece of writing, to lean into some questions and practices.
Yeah. That's going to be beautiful. Well, Chuck, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We want another hour with you. So hopefully you'll be up for doing this again.
That would be so fun.
If you'd be up for that. We would love to do it again. And we just cannot encourage folks enough to go out, get the book, When Narcissism Comes to the Church. And you'll be blessed, and the church will be blessed by it too. And so we'll make sure and put any links to connect to you in our, when we release the podcast.
Yeah.
I want to say too, I want to encourage everyone who's listening, those 4 questions, I triple dog dare you.
That was
take
hot.
Those 4 questions this week to 3 or 4 people in your life. How do you experience me? And then remember what Chuck's response was to the student. Tell me more.
Yes.
Don't deflect. Just listen. Tell me more. And then the 3 trusted friends to ask the question, like, how am I showing up in the world? What voices am I listening to? And where am I taking my hunger? That was amazing. Thank you.
That was worth the ticket right there.
Yeah, that's good. And, you know, I think with the book that you wrote, I wrote, a few of these others have written, I think, you know, church if you're a church staff, pastor, church staff listening to this, put a couple of these books in conversation. Read mine alongside yours and compare notes. So what are some of the resonances here? What are we hearing? How are we being challenged? What does this mean for our system? Because there's a lot of good stuff happening. And as you and I were talking about before the outset of this, none of us are in competition. None of us are making a whole lot of money doing this anyway. So this isn't a competition. This is a season, though, I would say, of some reckoning within the church. And so we really need to pay attention. But then we need books like The Starfish and the Spirit to say, so now what? How then shall we live, right? Where do we go from here? And so thank you for that. So,
well,
guys.
In mentioning, the other books, and you mentioned a couple of times Scott McKnight and Laura Beringer's book, Church of Tove. And this is why I would love to have another conversation with you, talking about cultural narcissism in churches. And you definitely hit that in the book.
Yeah.
So we could really have a whole conversation on that if you'd be up for that.
We could trace it all the way back to the founding of America Manifest Destiny. There are all sorts of really fascinating.
Okay, we're going to do a new podcast series. We're just going to start the whole deal.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you guys. Thanks for your work.
You likewise. Then thank you for being with us.
And Chuck, just finally, if anyone wants to find you on the internet, where can they go to find more? On the interwebs. Yeah. So chuckdegroat.net is the website, and at Chuck DeGroat on Twitter and all the other things. I'm out there somewhere.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for listening to this latest episode of The Starfish in the Church. We'll be back with another episode soon.